It was the year 1815, and Europe stood at the brink of another war. Napoleon Bonaparte, once a ruler of much of the continent, had returned from exile on the island of Elba. His dreams of restoring his empire had not faded. They burned even brighter. The news spread quickly. Napoleon was marching once again to reclaim his throne, and all of Europe would respond to this threat. The stage was set for one of the most dramatic confrontations in history. A battle that would decide not only Napoleon's fate, but the future of Europe itself. The early summer morning of June 18, 1815, was quiet, but this calm was deceiving. The rolling hills of Waterloo, in what is now modern-day Belgium, would soon become a battlefield. On one side, standing tall and determined, were the forces of Napoleon, his soldiers known for their fierce loyalty and battle-hardened resolve. Napoleon himself, dressed in his military uniform and adorned with his signature bicorn hat, paced nervously as he prepared for the battle that would seal his legacy. Across from him stood the Allied forces, commanded by two great men, the British Duke of Wellington and the Prussian General Gebhard Leberecht von Blücher. The British forces, comprising soldiers from the United Kingdom, the Netherlands, and several other European nations, were ready for battle. On their flank, the Prussian forces were slowly making their way toward the battlefield. The tension was palpable as both sides awaited the first strike. Napoleon wasted no time. The battle began with a massive artillery bombardment as French cannons unleashed a thunderous barrage, shaking the earth beneath the soldiers' feet. On the battlefield, smoke billowed in every direction, clouding the view and making it difficult to see the enemy's movements. The French army, known for its incredible discipline, advanced in waves. French cavalry, their horses galloping furiously, charged toward the British lines, hoping to break their defenses with sheer force. The British soldiers, standing firm in their squares, fired volley after volley of musket fire. The sharp crack of muskets echoed across the field as British officers barked orders, urging their men to hold fast. The French cavalry met a brutal resistance, unable to break the British formations. The initial push by Napoleon's forces had failed. Napoleon's strategic genius lay in his ability to adapt quickly, but even he could not ignore the weather. The battlefield had been drenched by rain, turning the ground to mud. The heavy French cavalry struggled to maneuver through the thick, wet earth, and the artillery was slowed by the boggy conditions. Napoleon had hoped that his overwhelming numbers would crush the Allied forces quickly, but the battle was turning into a war of attrition. As the day wore on, the fighting grew more intense. The French forces tried to capture key positions like the farmhouses of Hougoumont and La Haye-Sainte, which Wellington had turned into strongholds. Despite several attempts, the French were repelled. The British held their ground, refusing to yield an inch. Hours into the battle, just as the French seemed to gain ground, the tide began to shift. From the east, a distant rumble could be heard. The Prussian army, which had been marching to the sound of battle, finally arrived. Their leader, General Blücher, had pushed his soldiers through the rain and mud with relentless determination, knowing that the outcome of this battle could change the course of history. The arrival of the Prussian forces was like a hammer strike to Napoleon's forces. The French were now caught between two powerful armies. The British and Prussian forces, united by their common goal, pressed forward, squeezing Napoleon's army into a vice. The French, once so confident, began to falter. By late afternoon, the French forces were retreating. Napoleon's elite Imperial Guard, the last line of defense, made one final, desperate charge. But it was too late. The British and Prussians were relentless. Napoleon's forces, already worn down by hours of fighting, the Imperial Guard was broken, and the French soldiers, once proud and resolute, began to scatter. Napoleon himself, witnessing the collapse of his army, knew that his reign was over. The Emperor of the French, the man who had once ruled an empire that spanned much of Europe, was forced to retreat. The battlefield, once a place of fierce fighting and bloodshed, was now silent except for the cries of the wounded and the groans of those who had fallen. As night fell, the Battle of Waterloo came to an end. The French army had been decisively defeated. Napoleon's dreams of empire had crumbled. In the aftermath, Europe would never be the same. Napoleon, the great military genius, would be exiled once again, this time to the remote island of St. Helena, where he would live out the rest of his days in obscurity. The Napoleonic Wars, which had consumed the continent for over a decade, were over. For the British and Prussians, it was a moment of triumph, but the cost of the victory was high. Thousands of soldiers on both sides lay dead or wounded, and the landscape of Europe had been forever altered by the destruction of war. The Battle of Waterloo was not just a military clash, it was the end of an era. The fall of Napoleon marked the conclusion of a chapter in European history that had been defined by ambition, conquest, and revolution. For the people of Europe, it was a new beginning, one that would lead to a century of relative peace and the rise of new powers. But for Napoleon, it was a bitter end to a life filled with glory, ambition, and ultimately defeat. And as the sun set on that fateful day in June, the echoes of the Battle of Waterloo would reverberate throughout history, forever reminding the world of the fragility of power, the cost of war, and the unpredictable march of time.